This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about what happens when a system built to move slowly is forced to move fast. When rules designed for patience are suddenly asked to contain urgency. When institutions stop assuming cooperation and start preparing for defiance. Tonight looks dramatic because it is loud, but the danger isn't the noise. The danger is the quiet shift underneath it. A shift where enforcement replaces expectation, where process accelerates because delay itself becomes a risk. You are watching a threshold being crossed, not argued over, crossed. And once the system learns it can compress time, it rarely unlearns that lesson. It just waits for the next moment it feels justified. If you want to understand what's actually moving right now and why it won't slow down, stay with me. This matters more than the headline you think this is. Because the reason this happened is not the reason it keeps happening. What actually controls a system like this is not outrage. It's not elections. It's not even ideology. It's leverage over time. For decades, power learned a simple trick. Delay long enough and consequences thin out. Appeals stretch. Investigations stall. Attention moves on. The calendar becomes a shield. But that only works if everyone agrees to move slowly. What changed here is not a personality. It's the refusal to keep waiting. When rules are ignored repeatedly, the system has two options. Absorb the damage or reroute authority. And when it reroutes, it does so through the only channels that still function under stress. Procedure, documentation, deadlines. That's why this moment feels compressed, not emotional. Mechanical, a system that stops trusting restraint, starts trusting records. Paper trails, votes, security plans. This isn't escalation because of anger. It's escalation because patience failed. And once patience fails, speed becomes policy. That's the shift most people miss. And it's already moving forward because the next question isn't who broke the rules. It's what the system does when it decides it can't wait anymore. There was a time when this kind of stress moved slowly. Years, not days. Back then, pressure diffused. It leaked out through hearings, statements, delays. Before, the system assumed compliance. If you lost in court, you complied. If you were warned, you adjusted. If you were sanctioned, you stopped. Now, that assumption is gone. What replaced it wasn't announced. It was normalized. Repeated violations became background noise. Contempt became routine. Defiance stopped shocking anyone. And that is the most dangerous kind of change. The kind that happens gradually enough to feel survivable. Until it isn't. Slow shifts don't trigger alarms. They train institutions to tolerate strain, to stretch norms, to keep functioning under abnormal conditions. But every system has a breaking point. Not a dramatic one, a procedural one. A moment when accumulated exceptions harden into a new rule, where tolerance flips into enforcement, where we'll handle this later becomes later is no longer safe. That's where we are now. Not reacting to one action, reacting to a pattern that refused to stop. And when patterns refuse to stop, systems don't argue with them. They contain them. That containment is what comes next. What happened next looks like a shock. It feels sudden, but it isn't the story. It's the symptom. A line was crossed quietly, then documented carefully, then escalated formally, not with rhetoric, with paper. Warnings didn't stop the behavior. Sanctions didn't stop it either. So the system did the one thing it almost never does. It stopped recycling enforcement internally and pushed it outward. A formal referral, not a comment, not a rebuke, a transfer of responsibility. That move matters because it changes who carries the risk. Courts enforce rules. Legislatures enforce legitimacy. When judicial authority hands a record to a political body, it's saying something precise. This is no longer containable here. That's why security postures changed immediately. Why timelines collapsed? Why votes that once waited suddenly couldn't? This wasn't escalation for drama. It was escalation for survival. And once that referral exists, everything downstream reorganizes around it. All actors, all incentives, because now delay isn't neutral. Delay becomes dangerous. And that's the moment systems fear most, when stopping feels riskier than acting. And that fear is now in motion. What most people never see is how the damage is actually distributed. The system doesn't break evenly. It redirects strain. At the center, authority tightens. Rules harden. Procedures accelerate. At the edges, people absorb the cost. Staff, witnesses, civil servants, security officers, voters trying to live inside uncertainty. This is how the mechanism works. When defiance persists, institutions stop negotiating behavior and start insulating themselves from it. They document everything. They narrow discretion. They lock timelines. Those who benefit are the parts of the system built for force and speed. Committees with emergency rules, agencies with enforcement power, security structures designed for worst cases. Those who pay are everyone else, because flexibility disappears first. And when flexibility disappears, mistakes get punished faster. Speech gets riskier. Silence becomes strategic. This isn't about punishment. It's about containment. The system isn't trying to win. It's trying to prevent spread. And once containment becomes the goal, escalation stops being a choice. It becomes automatic. That's why what follows no longer feels political. It feels operational, and operations don't ask permission. They move. What comes next moves even faster. Now everything speeds up. Shorter timelines, harder edges, less tolerance. Security expands first, quietly, then visibly barricades. Deployments, contingency plans layered on top of each other, because once institutions stop assuming restraint, they plan for breach. Statements get sharper. Silence gets louder. Every action is interpreted for risk, not intent. This is where miscalculation becomes dangerous. Not because of one decision, but because of accumulation. Each new move is read through the lens of escalation. Each delay looks like defiance. Each message looks like pressure, and pressure changes behavior. People stop waiting for clarity. They act on worst-case assumptions. That's how systems slide from governance into security mode. Not with a declaration, with preparation. Nothing here feels chaotic from the inside. It feels controlled, methodical, which is exactly why it's so unstable. Because once a system flips into acceleration, it doesn't slow down on its own. It needs an external shock to stop, and no one knows what that shock will be yet. That uncertainty is the real cliff. This is the part where it stops being abstract. Where it reaches you, you feel it as noise first, then tension, then interruption. Commutes rerouted, buildings closed. Sirens where there usually aren't any. You start adjusting your behavior without noticing. You check headlines more often. You choose words more carefully. You hesitate before sharing, before speaking, before assuming tomorrow will look like today. That's not paranoia. That's adaptation. Systems under stress transmit pressure downward, and you are where that pressure lands. When institutions accelerate, everyday life compresses. Decisions come faster. Mistakes cost more. Uncertainty lasts longer. You're told this is temporary, that it will pass. But systems don't always return to their original speed. If you want to understand why that matters, why moments like this leave permanent marks, stay with me. Because what you're experiencing isn't fear, it's calibration. And calibration doesn't reverse easily. What's coming next doesn't stay contained inside borders or buildings. It spreads. What happens next doesn't stay local. Systems like this broadcast signals, not speeches, signals. Allies read instability as risk. Markets read it as volatility. Adversaries read it as opportunity, not because they want chaos, because they plan for advantage. When a political system shifts into emergency posture, it changes how commitments are perceived. Treaties feel conditional. Leadership feels temporary. Decision-making looks distracted. That ripple moves fast. Currency pressure, diplomatic hedging, quiet recalculations about reliability, nothing dramatic on the surface. Just small adjustments everywhere at once. And those adjustments compound. The danger isn't invasion or collapse. It's misalignment. When external systems stop assuming continuity, they start testing boundaries. Economically, politically, cyber. Informationally, not to provoke, to measure. This is how internal stress becomes external exposure. Not through weakness, through distraction. And once multiple systems begin adapting simultaneously, control fragments. No single actor is steering anymore. That's when outcomes become unpredictable. Because the next phase doesn't depend on one decision. It depends on reactions to reactions. And those are already in motion. From here, the future stops being a single line. It splits. There are 3 paths, all plausible, none clean. The first is adjustment. Institutions absorb the shock, rules tighten. Timelines normalize again, just faster than before. The system survives, but changed. More rigid, less forgiving, functioning, but narrower. The second path is erosion. Nothing breaks outright. Instead, trust thins. Every action is litigated, every decision questioned. Authority exists, but credibility doesn't. The system keeps moving, but friction becomes permanent. Governance turns brittle. The third path is rupture, not collapse. Fragmentation. Parallel claims of legitimacy, competing centers of authority, security structures acting ahead of consensus, process outruns consent. None of these paths announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly through behavior. Which one emerges depends on what happens next. On restraint, on escalation, on whether speed keeps replacing deliberation. And that choice is still unresolved. Because the system hasn't decided what lesson it's learning yet, that decision is coming. What happens next won't feel like relief. It won't feel like justice. It won't feel like closure. It will feel unfinished because systems under stress don't resolve stories. They establish precedents. Whatever line gets crossed or doesn't becomes usable later by someone else under different pressure. With different justification, that's the part that should keep you watching. Not for the outcome, for the habit being formed. A system that learns to move fast in crisis rarely relearns how to wait. A system that normalizes emergency tools doesn't put them back on the shelf untouched. It remembers how effective they were. So don't look for comfort in what happens next. Look for signals. What gets rushed? What gets bypassed? What suddenly feels acceptable? If you want to understand where this is heading, not just today, but the next time pressure spikes, stay with me. Follow the process, not the personalities. Because the danger isn't who this is used against. It's that now it exists. And once a system learns it can move this way, the question is never if it will again. It's when